Bueno, sí, por favor, buenas tardes. Buenas tardes. Les pedimos de favor tomar sus asientos. Vamos a dar inicio al siguiente panel.
Our fourth panel of the forum. Could the audience please take your seats? We will now begin with our next session. It's session number 4. The moderator of this panel would be Marco Antonio Baños, board member of the Federal Electoral Institute. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a great honor for me to be the moderator in the presentation of the thoughts of our outstanding panelists. I'm going to give you a brief presentation of these panelists. They are people with a great trajectory and celebrities in their own areas. First of all, I present Carina Perelli. As you know, she's an Uruguayan consultant with an extensive experience in the electoral topics. She was a high-profile official for the United Nations, and she served most recently as director of the Electoral Assistance Division. She was responsible for operations in over 60 countries. She has played a main role in the electoral transitions in countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, East Timor, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria. And she has also led efforts to develop a comprehensive regional strategy for electoral and political transition in the Middle East. Undoubtedly, she is a person with a great professional trajectory, and she will share with us her thoughts. I would also like to introduce Paulina Duarte. She is a Brazilian professional with an extensive experience in the development and implementation of public policies in the field of justice, health, public safety, and drugs. During the last decade, she has taken up several senior government positions in the federal government of Brazil, the last of them being as National Secretary for Drug Policies, a position that she held between 2011 and 2013. She currently serves as Director of the Public Security Department of the OAS. I also would like to introduce the Secretary of Prevention and Citizen Participation in Mexico. He is a Mexican politician and lawyer, has held various positions in public administration, such as General Director of the Committee for Development Planning, Director of the Economic Planning in the Federal District, and the Consumer's Federal Attorney. He was also a representative in the Federal District and in the Federal Legislature number 56. He was also the Executive Secretary of the National Public Security System in the administration of Felipe Calderón, and he is currently, as I mentioned, serves as the Secretary of Prevention and Citizen Participation in Mexico. Welcome, Mr. Campa. And I would also like to introduce a very dear friend of mine with a great professional trajectory, with a self-respect. He's a National Autonomous University of Mexico researcher with a great trajectory, Sergio García Ramírez, doctor at law by the UNAM. He has been justice at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and he has been the head of the PRI party in Mexico. He was also president of the rector of the Lecumberri prison. He also was an electoral board member of IFE, and also a researcher with the most important school in Mexico. This panel, as Manuel Carrillo has stated, has to do with a topic that is very important, that has to do with the state and the security in the democratic consolidation processes. We have some democratic processes that are facing very complicated situations in topics such as public security and topics linked to the issues of drug dealing and other elements, which place us in a very complicated situation in Latin American democracies. Specifically in this panel, our guests will contribute with reflection on several topics. First, it would be important that you could give an answer to one question. Who is actually ruling in the region? Are informal powers or formal powers that are institutionalized? Facing a structure in the world economy, what strategies should the countries in the region follow so that Latin American democracies keep on drawing a path for their societies? Another thing that is a suggestion to answer is to say, do you think it is possible that the democracy may have instruments that could contain organized crime or terrorist groups without dealing with the freedom regime? Another issue we should consider is what is the situation of criminal organizations that are dealing with drug trafficking for 2020, and if the current trends continue in that time. So we are being suggested to do a time analysis. And the final concern that the panel should answer is how are we going to be facing the growing capacities and resources of the organized crime and their infiltration in the Latin American countries with security policies that could respect human rights but that at the same time are efficient. These are some of the topics that we want to develop and talk about in this panel, but of course these are in no way limiting, and you could just give us your opinion freely on what you want to say. I would also like to say to our panelists that the mechanic of this panel is going to be a first round of a 10-minute slot, and then we'll have a second round of interventions based on the reflections given on the first round. After the second round, we're going to have some of the questions from our audience. So So if I may, I would like to leave the floor to Carina Perelli. So she gives us her presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I don't need to remind this audience that in a certain way guaranteeing life and security is a keynote from the governments. That's one thing that we have to remember, and that is the basis for the social pact. But this that seems so simple at first sight is extremely complicated, since we are now in Latin America, we are now going through some situations that I call segmented realities. So my first main topic is that facing a very weak market with a low density in several of the other topics, security or safety for whom and why? Today there are at least 3 or 4 main groups. Those who are very rich and who have made security a private matter and have segmented the power of the state with the actions, for example, on what was happening in Brazil, and that they called these concentration camps, or cities such as Sao Paulo, where transit situations are a matter of tracing helicopter routes on which 1% of the population is transporting themselves. We have a middle class that doesn't know quite right what got back to and pledged to, and then we also have this very big phenomenon of the poor, who also live extreme segmentation and who have at a certain point some rules of their own, and who also at some times set out, if they are not incorporated to the formal mechanisms of the society and the rule of law, depend on some benefits of what we call the parallel state. This takes us to have a perception of the other as a kind of threat in our societies. I very well know that the violence figures are very important. When I was in Afghanistan, I used to say that the number of casualties in Mexico by violent deaths was extremely higher than what we were living in Afghanistan. But in a certain point of view, we also have a problem of sensation from some groups, and the most vocal groups, which are the middle class, who are the ones who depend on the security mechanisms of the state to survive. They are changing, they are making a transformation of this uncertainty into a growing insecurity sensation. They are feeling attacked. And they see insecurity all around them, even when there isn't any. And usually when they are feeling attacked, of course they are going to suggest policies that are very harsh. This takes access to a kind of magma in the topic of security, because we all very well know that security is nowadays not just repression or education or just social policies. It is a combination of all of these. But in a democracy, it is also required to give an answer and to give an answer to our citizenship. So if you're setting out solutions that are immediate, that are repressive or military, such as militarization in different regions of Latin America that has been going on, we are having growing threats to the formal authorities of the state. And this is not only happening in Latin America. In fact, the regions of the world in which I have been, they all have a kind of a vicious cycle of poverty, lack of opportunities, dismemberment, organized crime, drug trafficking, but also insurgent groups and paradigm cases such as in Libya, in which the revolution and rebellion was exclusively based on the smuggling groups up until the international community intervenes, and mainly where there is an engagement between the organized groups and organized crime groups, and who increase this insurgent moves. This kind of marriage or complementation to commit crimes against the state, of course, could occur in any part of the world. But there are some particular elements of what happens with the transnationalization of crime. I've seen Colombian citizens where in Colombia now they have changed and transformed into a drug state. It's an element that has transformed the processes of the so-called Arab Spring. And they are behind the number of social protests that support, or they're trying to support these social protests. So on one hand we have those who are very poor, extremely poor, who are practically having to come to these delinquent organizations such as Maras or gangs, just to provide for their survival, their basic survival. On the other hand, we have middle-class groups, especially now when we can see and we are living all over the world, a rebellion that is happening in the middle class, whether it's those classes that are developing in Latin America or those descending middle classes in the rest of the Western world, who are expressing their unhappiness, their discontent, and who are, and also those rich, those 1%, who are of course pressuring the state, who are buying officers, public servants, because it's not only the organized crime who is corrupting the state structures, it's also the financial sector, big corporations, all kinds of institutions, and in the end, state, which is already very weak, has the responsibility of, on one side, having to manage the situation as best as possible without violating the fundamental rights and guarantees through a justice system that is sometimes very, very weak too, or that is very, very harsh, or with prison systems that are extremely complicated to manage between inmates and wardens. And on the other side, we have politicians who are easily corruptible, or that may be buying votes to get to the positions where they are in winning the elections. With this scenario that is so hacked, in which in Latin America we are just seeing it from a violence point of view, and that is evolving more and more, especially in those places where we have Mara pacts, as in El Salvador. Maras are some gangs, with an increase in assassinations and homicides, and in a policy of extortion and extortion crimes, in which the extortion becomes a social and political practice that is acceptable. So it's completely the opposite of an election. If an election is a mechanism to manage conflict in a peaceful way through the negotiation of the actors, in which everybody loses something or gets something out of these negotiations. In the case of these extortion practices, and once again, it does not happen only in Latin America. The recent show that our neighbors from the north are showing to us between the executive branch and the legislative branch, it's also a kind of extortion, an institutionalized extortion, because that makes citizens to lose trust on the democracy and on legal and democratic processes for the rule of law to solve the problem of democracy, of violence and security. But citizens are also claiming a harsher hand than authoritarianism. So it's very worrying in this way. All that surveys in Latin America are showing in that there are solutions of rule of law that are violating, and solutions that are violating human rights and of democratic solutions are thus becoming acceptable. They are becoming, especially for a middle class that is so hacked and suffering, they become almost desirable. So if you could see one of the countries, the harsh policy of El Salvador was followed by the extreme harsh policies in El Salvador, had results that, as my friend Eduardo Núñez said before coming in this panel, it's like these repressive harsh measures are like diets. You lose 10 pounds while you're on this diet, but then you gain 20 pounds. And all all of this is undermining the trust and confidence on not only the democracy and the state, but on the state as a capacity of a group of us providing for the weakest in all the topics, and especially on those topics of life preservation. Thank you, Carina Perelli, for your intervention. I believe that in such a short amount of time, it's very difficult to just have such a relevant reflection of the one she was sharing with us. Of course, there are some important ideas ready for debate, but I also believe that we will have a second round to share some of these aspects. Now I ask Dr. Paulina Duarte that she takes the floor. Good afternoon. I appreciate my fellow panelists, and I thank the IFE for the invitation to be with you today. Ladies and gentlemen, violence and crime are one of the main threats for the democratic strengthening and consolidation in Latin America and the Caribbean, as the organized crime has spread its presence throughout our hemisphere. It has also spread the most strict looks that considered it just a political matter, to be assumed as one of the main risk factors in the democracy in our region. The growing concern of criminality and violence in some of the regions has political impacts that are negative for the whole hemisphere, affecting the governance engines that are democratic, the stability, the public legitimacy of the governance and of authorities and institutions, the public sphere, as well as the quality of the political regimes who are questioned now for the growing levels of insecurity and the acts of the criminals. In this hemisphere, we have had a period of time that's been trended through a relative democratic stability. Most of the citizens in Latin America can exercise their right to vote and can also have an active political participation in a framework of respect to civil and political rights. However, public insecurity brings to the table the weaknesses of our system that is still building with such young democracies. In this context, this is deepening those and making more patent those weaknesses of the institutions and that are fostering criminal societies. To provide that the political impacts in the context of criminality and violence are differentiated. This depends not only on the type of infrastructure and illegal economies that are present in the countries, but also of the capacity of the state to undermine those effects. In different parts of the continent, there are areas without governance where the state has a very weak presence, with a low capacity and ability to provide security for the citizens. We can also see some areas in this region while they have state institutions, these have been occupied and are falling to the pressure of the criminal sectors. It is important to point out that the political impact does not only depend on the state presence, but also on the quality and the protection of these institutions and to the influence of the legal actors. It's exactly this situation, crime and violence against the institutions of the state, which is going to determine the impact in the political systems. under this light, a question that is constantly coming in the debate is what is the baseline of organized delinquency in this dynamics of violence and insecurity. Along these lines, organized crime is mobile for illegality and violence that is generated from the emergence of the different illegal economies. Frequently, the homicide rates and increase in crime have a background of emergence of organized crime groups. We like to have a monopoly of the illegality, both in their weapon dimension and in their economic dimension. This situation is making it difficult to make a difference between the organized crime and a regular kind of crime, whose connections are spreading under the logics of economical benefit. In this context, public security is affected by a group of criminal groups that are more or less providing for a situation of uncertainty where the definition of actors, the way in which they relate internally and externally, and their operations are very difficult to make up. In illegal economies, the bigger presence of organized crime and greater presence of organized crime are affecting all of the countries in the region, who are eventually becoming transit regions and who are also producing and consuming illegal products. So I'm just assuming that this is just sending security in its most basic definition, becoming one of the main challenges for the consolidation of democracies in this region. Democracies that are seeing their foundations undermined if they don't give an answer to this threat or combat it. With this point of view, the state members of the OAS have agreed on some measures in a key document for our region. The Declaration of Security in the Americas that was agreed on here in Mexico in 2003 and have just turned 10 years old. This document, as a concept of multidimensional security, acknowledges that the states of this region must face not only these old threats to the security, but they should also attend to these new threats, such as terrorism, organized crime at international level, the global problem of drug trafficking, corruption, money laundering, and illicit traffic of weapons, extreme poverty, and social exclusion of great amounts of the population, who are also affecting the stability of this democracy. Natural disasters that are generated by human beings, AIDS and other diseases are risks to our health, and that deteriorate our environment. Human trafficking attacks, cyber attacks, and many other issues. And give an answer to these problems within a framework of rule of law. And we should develop some security measures that are transparent, that are accountable to our citizens, and that respect human rights. We should also remember the main budgets of the state and the rule of law with regards to security. In first place, the state has a monopoly of physical acting that must be legitimate and be based on the rule of law framework. And second of all, these security forces who are subject to civilian governance, who are legally elected, which due to a sustained legitimacy in their democracy. We must promote in our states the citizenship participation in security. The lack of community has generated a deterioration of the social mesh and have affected the traditional political models. Education and promotion of values and strengthening of leadership are essential to recover this linkage between society and state. All security policies should be accompanied by the empowering of citizens. This also comes in this context a need for security forces to be accountable to the law, to the state, and to citizens. Accountability and transparency go hand in hand. Transparency and security management that have effects through report of their procedures should go beyond the borders of the security institutions of the state. Accountability should happen before the supervising agencies, including courts, legislative bodies, the media, citizens, who are all becoming a pole of support for security in democracy. Accountability implies a permanent evaluation of the security institution. This requires a development of reliable indicators that allow us to assess, among other aspects, the human resources, election mechanisms, and all kinds of mechanisms that allow us to choose the state agents that make up our security institutions, labor conditions and the paying of this, as well as the equipment and transportation and communication methods that are available to comply with their objectives. These indicators, however, should not be based exclusively on the quantitative dimension. It is utmost necessary to have indicators that measure quality to allow us to generate in our security measures a quality in the provision of services. From this perspective, accountability is an organizational principle that is articulated through the transparency, together with confidence and trust, will allow the development of a co-responsibility on security matters together with the citizenship. Finally, security in a democratic state requires the full respect and promotion of the human rights of the citizens, and also of those men and women who are working in the security sector, particularly those who in the security sector who must generate a gender law, who incorporate females to their functions, as the Inter-American or Women's Commission has stated. The lack of security measures for women and the lack of spaces for making decisions in reference to citizen security translates into a security policy of most of the countries in the region is ignoring more than 50% of the population of these countries. The American region has achieved great advances in the articulation of democratic regimes. However, it still has a long way to go. There is still a process to consolidate these democracies. In this context, citizen security must generate policies of security that encourage participation and that respect human rights. This would be an important step towards the consolidation of democracy in our region. Thank you very much. to the Director of Public Security of the OAS. We are a little delayed in our times, but I pass the floor now to the Undersecretary or Vice Minister of Prevention and Citizens Participation, Mr. Roberto Campa. Thank you very much. Thank you to the IFE for this opportunity to share this panel with the panel members, distinguished members. Thank you to the Colegio de Mexico, this School of Excellence, for opening its doors for this event. I'm going to try to answer 3 of the questions that were posed to us. The first one, who orders or who rules the region? The second one, this dichotomy, this relationship between democracy and organized crime. And the third one that talks about how to face the resources and the growing capacity of the organized crime. Who rules the region? I think it would be a good idea to begin by analyzing who rules modern states. That has been set forth by Dyston Sholo. In lesser or greater measure, all of these are important in modern states. The government rules. The government legally incorporated, but it will never be able to rule by itself. International bodies also rule. The multinational firms also rule. The entrepreneurs, the financial people, local and international, also rule. The specialists rule. The experts rule. The innovators, the ones that respond, and of course, also, in some cases more important than others, organized crime. It looks to me that it would be also a good idea to begin by expressing the difficulty that is implied in trying to say that the region is the same throughout. Because I think that we have very deep differences, not only from one country to another one, but also within each country. I'm going to use one of the indicators, because even though it is not the only indicator, it is the indicator that actually reflects how important are the rules of organized crime. Because for my presentation, I'm only going to talk about organized crime. In Mexico, we have underwent a security crisis, which in 2012 took us to have 22.18 murders for every 100,000 inhabitants. 22.18 per 100,000. However, in the region, we have Peru, 24.1, Ecuador with 30.55, Colombia that has progressed a lot with 31.06, Guatemala with 39.95, El Salvador with more than 40, Venezuela with more than 53, and Honduras with more than 83. So Mexico, I insist, 22.18. It's similar to Brazil's 21.66, and naturally it's way above many other cities, but places, but we are country number 15 out of 34. Chile, it's the best with 3.14, and Argentina with 5.5. So I think it would be a good idea to say that not all the countries of the region are the same. And if we go within, we'll see that throughout Mexico we don't have the same situation. 22 point something was Mexico, 22.18, but Guerrero is 107, Chihuahua 80.03, or Sinaloa 73.3. So we have Yucatan with 2.67, not just as the best, or Hidalgo 4.5, or Aguascalientes 5.3. So I think it is very difficult to state who is actually ruling and then make a generalization of what's going on within the countries or within the region, because of course there are different ideas. In our prevention program, we are right now working in about 101,000 neighborhoods divided into 216 polygons. The ones that are actually registered as the most dangerous one. So it would not be objective to say that organized crime is the one that rules here. So what does all these mean? I think that we have different factors here. The most important one is the geographical factor. We have a border with a very large border with the most important economy throughout the world, and also with the society that demands the largest amount of drugs in the world. This border implies a constant traffic of illegal money, of drugs, of people, weapons, and it implies a fundamental factor for Mexico and for the regions that have the most important problems of violence related with the route of access of drugs into the United States. However, we also need to acknowledge something else. We have a series of international institutional factors that need to be taken into account. And now let's go into the second question that has to do with democracy against organized crime. I think that these institutional weaknesses that have to do, for example, with security officers or security forces that were created for a different purpose, and then a security system and an imprisonment system that we are trying to adjust, looks like we must also acknowledge that the transition that we have had in the last years also implied a loss of control of all those institutions. And this phenomenon is not exclusive to Mexico. We also seen it repeated throughout the world. A very close example is Spain. Spain, right after the transition, had a horrible crisis originated not by drug dealing but by terrorism. And those that were part of this process said that the crisis began because lack of coordination, distrust that was created by that fragmented the power because they were not sharing information and they did not do any intelligence activities. So I think that the main challenge that we have in Mexico, and actually on which we are working, is the development of a coordination system to impose the rules to organize crime in the scheme of divided government and power fragmentation. And then the other factors that also explained these phenomenon of violence are linked with the risk factors. And here I'm talking about the prevention tasks. The last question is how to face the resources and funds of organized crime in a democratic country. And we're not only talking about economic funds or weapons, which are very important, but the resources are mainly the human resources. Organized crime requires throughout its process the recruitment of people for transportation, for retail sale, for wholesale, they need people, and it looks to me that the security crisis is linked to those risk factors, and these risk factors have made organized crime capable of recruiting people, especially young people. Young people are currently in the center of violence in our country, in the violent areas of our country. Young people are usually the victims and the perpetrators, and that is why the main cause of death in our country is homicide. And I reiterate, and I think that we must work to modify these risk factors, turn them into opportunities, and by doing that, taking away from organized crime the possibility of action. And I think that is the possibility to recruit people. When we make a comparison, when we want to overlap the criminal information of the areas where we have more problems, all the social problems, because of social backwardness, we are talking about exactly the same areas. The same areas have the same issues and have these issues repeated. So if we analyze what's going on in these regions, we find that we must modify those conditions, because common factors have to do with poverty, marginalization, urban disorder, overcrowd, and poverty. Domestic violence, usually generated by drug abuse, legal and illegal. School violence that is not being addressed with the serious protocol. It has to do with the incapacity to use free time by means of practicing sports or cultural things. And at the end of the day, it has to do with the lack of capacity to offer this, to offer employment to young people. So how can you convince them about the importance of education? How do you want them to trust in education, to build their project of life, if they're not going to have the opportunities to do so? And that is why, and this is actually an advertisement, because I want to take this opportunity to say that we are totally dedicated to the security strategy of our country. We are totally dedicated to put the citizen right in the center of our policies. We have identified 57 regions, 210 polygons, and more than 1,000 neighborhoods. We are working together, 9 ministries at a federal level and state and municipal governments, in order to change the situation, in order to modify the risk factors that I've talked about and turn them into opportunity factors, and therefore reduce the capacity of organized crime to recruit these young people that they have. And I finish by repeating the main challenge of our democracies, of the young incipient democracies, is to change those conditions, to prove that they are not only good, to have clean, transparent electoral process in order to elect those that are going to be in power, that are going to be ruling our communities. But the challenge of our democracy is so that we are more efficient, so that we can do better as society, and therefore we can do better as country. Thank you very much. Thank you, Vice Minister Roberto Campa, for his important insight and all the information that he has provided to us in order to analyze this topic. With this, we come to the end of the first round of participation. Now, I pass the floor to Dr. Sergio García Ramírez as the last one of the panel members to participate in this round of presentations. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this forum. Dear Professor, it is an honor for me, and it also gives me the opportunity to share my ideas with the distinguished panel members. With your venue, I would like to talk during these few minutes that I have, to take 1 minute, because otherwise I would not feel satisfied, to express to my dear colleagues of the IFE my deep appreciation, my sympathy, and my respect. Leonardo Valdez is not here in physical presence, but somehow he is here. So I please request the moderator of this forum to take my regards to Licenciado Valdez. I am totally convinced that he has done an excellent job, totally transparent and totally dedicated to the country. The board members of the IFE, and sometimes also the ones that worked with me in the board, Mr. Baños, are about to finish their administration, and I have in my memory the great memories of the times shared and the admiration and appreciation for what you've done for the IFE in favor of democracy. And I apologize for taking this opportunity to express my feelings, but maybe this is the very last opportunity for me to say so in a forum of this size. I am sure I will be able to repeat it in different presentations. When we have to face a topic like the one we are facing today, when you hear things like the ones we have heard today, when you are going to say what I am about to say, there comes this feeling of deja vu. And I have already seen it. We have already seen it 1,000 times, and we have already said it 1,000 times. However, it's still convenient to keep on looking at it and to keep on saying it. It looks like the human system goes into crisis facing public security as if it were a dilemma, and if we had to decide and choose between security and human rights. Putting aside the fact that security is one of the human rights since 1789, it has been and it will always be. So don't let our memory be blurred and change the landscape of our human rights, and make sure that we have this open path, totally open as we have opened it throughout the years. When we talk about security, I want to talk about what we know as human security. That is the head of all the concepts of security, not only public security or national security or citizens' security, but human security, which represents the widest use, deployment, and exercise of the rights that belong to the citizens and the people that make up the society. So based upon that need, we can easily explain the monopoly of violence. When we analyze the action of the states, I think that we have to weight it by using as reference point this service that they provide for human security, the support that they offer, and the realization that they carry out to those being ruled, but that are therefore the citizens. That's the way we have qualified the states, and that is how we should weight what we call the state reform. It cannot only be a set of rules with the power of those in office. It has to be something shared with the citizens. In 1847, two remarkable authors talked about the fact that there was a ghost going through the world, and at that time they said that it was communism at that time. Many years have elapsed, and now we have another horseman that travels through the world, and that is now crime. Traditional crime and organized crime. And the latter, in its travel, is testing the convictions, the institutions, the juridical order, the commitments, and the promises. This speech is right at the age which has been increased by crime and the way we have responded to it. I think that a year ago in this forum, or maybe in another forum, I quoted Vargas Llosa when he made a comment of Mi tumba en los Andes. When he presents to us some questions not only about the fact of having a criminal issue going on in Latin America, or about the deep roots of these criminal phenomenon that we have not analyzed correctly from my point of view. This great author from America talked about all evils that were buried and then came out to the face of illegality. We must study the situation from its roots, its nature, and its consequences. These old buried evils in Mexico, we thought they were totally buried, have come to the surface and now are pursuing us. Crime, on the other hand, it's a horseman that goes beyond borders, that uses a different route to go throughout the world, as in comparison with the human rights that are also global. We have measured statistically all these phenomena, and that is good because we need to have that knowledge in order to analyze the situation. But as far as I know, we have not been able to promptly and deeply appreciate its nature, its sense, and its fate. Of course, there is great development, a peak of the institutions of what someone has called the institutions that want to have the ruling hand. Just to give you an adequate answer, even though they're not going to take over the power, but they exercise the power. However, they want to do so. The relationship between criminals and state has changed in a very important manner. In all times, criminals will run away from the police, but then they did not run. They started to confront, and then they stopped. They purchased, they acquired benefits, and now they want to, and sometimes they are able to set up not only a parallel state, but to take over this state and to rule instead. This happens when arrogant crime dominates the lands, and this has happened in many places. When they take on the powers of the authority, when they take on the responsibility of the authority, either the police or the tax minister. That happens when they rule with promises or by creating fear in the population. This has an incredible impact in our life and in the life of future generations. There are always argument on the figures that have said about crime in certain regions, Mexico one of which. However, it also has to do with the increase of other expressions of crime, such as kidnapping and that type of crimes. The strategy to fight this issue is also a topic of debate. The rebalance of some of these strategies that were questioned was actually the creation of a cemetery full of dead bodies, and these dead bodies in that cemetery have not helped in the creation of the security actions and conditions that we want. It looks like, from my point of view, that Mexico had a refreshment wind, not as refreshing as the one that we have in this room, but on December 1st of the previous year, when the president of our country, in a remarkable speech, unforgettable one, pronounced himself for crime prevention and also for some of the fights against criminality. This meant, to my point of view, a change of path and a change of method. It also meant the commitment, and we must honor it, of not to rule with the code in your hands, but we also have that temptation to rule more than with the project, with the criminal code in hand. But the executive power at that time committed for a different thing and decided not to put in the account of the criminal justice what should be listed in the social justice account. This is an issue that has been widely analyzed in Latin America and in some other bodies that are totally dedicated to crime prevention. So let's give to social justice what they need, and let's give to criminal justice what they need. But let's not put all the responsibility on the criminal justice, because we are going to fall into that mistake. I've been said that I have 30 more minutes, but I'm only going to use 2. Sometimes we have incurred in what I would call an obsession that establishes illusions, and that is the obsession of law reforms. We have new laws every day. They send new laws as if those were the perfect solution for the many evils that we have, including insecurity. A very popular Mexican jurist, Mr. Emilio Rabasa, said, "We have trusted in our laws, and laws have shown to be totally incompetent. Perfect laws are made for imaginary citizens," just to show you the concept that has been already used by a researcher from this school, El Colegio de Mexico. What we have to do right now, I think it's already been done by many people, with goodwill and with some work, is to do serious reforms. And serious reforms is not legal or legislative reform. It's also the reform of the institutions, the reform of the behavior, and the reform of conduct. We already had in 2008 a criminal reform, which was not that clear because it created the acceptance and agreement of some of the ideas, but I think we need to review it and modify it again. But at that time, when the executive branch met with the legislative branch to speak about the need of a reform on criminal justice, they identified the factors that were actually doing the wrong things, and now we know that the same factors are here: impunity, corruption, lack of competency, and the fact that many of our rules and many of our institutions are already too old. When we have old rules, we can fix them, we can correct them if the legislative branch wants. But impunity, it's impossible to be fixed as easy. And corruption also needs constant, common, and shared action that should be kept on site forever, because sometimes we begin action but we do not continue them. I hope that what we have begun today continues. And I am going to finish now because I actually only have few seconds left. And I want to quote Napoleon's phrase about the use of force instead of intelligence. And his Taliban told Napoleon, with your weapons you can do whatever you want except sitting on them. So please, do not trust that this will only happen with weapons. We cannot sit on them to fix our public insecurity issues. There are other areas where we have to work with their state actions and, of course, the social actions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Dr. Sergio García Ramírez for his very important contribution in this forum. I have received such a huge amount of questions. Some of them are aimed particularly to one of our panelists, while others are directed to all of them in general. Of course, there are some concerns about some of the issues set out for this panel. So strictly on time matters, I'm going to suggest that you have an additional brief reflection of 3 minutes about some of the issues set out by our audience. I want to tell those who asked questions and that have noted their phone numbers or emails. I'm going to give them to our panelists so if they have any additional comments you can make them. Some of the questions are very similar, so I have organized them so that they are easier to use it. Terra Stanley from the Colegio de Mexico asks our panelists in general, what is the role of the United States in the regional combat against organized crime? This is a concern, a specific concern that's been set out. Particularly in the case of Dr. García Ramírez, he is being asked if, in his considerations, what is the true nature of crime? Is it an economic, education, institutional, moral, or ethical issue, or one of all with all these elements? Mr. Roberto Campa is asked, what are the features on those who rule in your country, and especially in Mexico, that make us think that the modern state is very vulnerable? In the case of Mexico, we are very close to a failed state. That is the question. Are we very close to a failed state? An interesting question made particularly to Carina Perelli is, from your experience in Afghanistan and in hostile environments, does it actually work with the civil society so that with building social trust we strengthen the electoral administration and also in Mexico, in the other radicalization of some political actors, how can we work with the civil society? There are some other questions that are aimed at our panelists. In this case, our guest from the OAS, Mrs. Paulina Duarte. Do you believe that the worst organized crime that we are living in Latin America is exercised by our very own government through the corruption, our self-enrichment, and a hunger for power? It is also a very interesting question. We are also being asked, in the specific case of Mexico, if the reform to the penal system, the criminal system, is more than enough to consolidate the justice system. And there's a question that engages to this. What is the relationship of universities and research centers, particularly with regards to the glories of the sports for the prevention of crime? I suggest that with these questions that we may not have the time to give an answer to all of them, but we are making a commitment that we would like to provide an answer through the electronic means. I suggest you have just a final consideration from our panelists for a 3-minute slot of time, and we follow the same order in which our guests made their interventions. So in the first place, Mrs. Carina Perelli has the floor. Thank you. When talking about the vulnerability of a state that is absolutely hacked from very different fronts. For example, in Argentina, a long time ago, a book was published that was named "Those Who Rule," and we are usually those who are ruling are not only those who are apparently ruling. The most serious problem in the current states is that, for example, a Peruvian sociologist is talking about the institutional density index of the state. And as my fellow panelists were saying, the problem is that the state today has a variability of density. It has variable populations. And it also has variable patterns and several degrees of autonomy. But I think I should make a more generalized reflection on this topic, a topic that in a certain way is happening to most of societies, that is the youth and violence. Because it is a topic on which, as of today, it's the greatest vulnerability of a modern state. When we are obliged to create a category called minis, or the youth who don't study and don't work, when the jobs offers are translated not only into a lack of income but a lack of a future, and I refer to what Dante was saying in the beginning of this forum. When our youth who has smartphones and mobile phones and Twitter and social networks, they do have this, but in the end they only have a very limited capacity to use Twitter to summon and call for mobilizations and all of this because they don't have any kind of project for the future. This is generating two things: a great degree of cynicism in terms of what are the democratic values and the state values, which takes us into a consequence in that any kind of organization is appealing to them, whether it's organized crime, terrorism, well, the environments in which I'm usually moving myself. I am just tired of seeing how there's a lack of horizon, how this lack of horizon in future causes recruitment of this youth. Their life is gray, their life is routinary. One day is exactly the same as the one before it. I want to say that it is very evident that we used to believe in those tomorrows that were very bright and of permanent future. We were talking about a new man. We learned a lot in this environment, but in this sphere. But I don't know if I would change deep down, if I would change my youth for that of my daughter, who knows 5 languages and has a master's degree but has no job. This is a very good opportunity for the organized crime, in the same way in which children nowadays who are going through poverty conditions are just shifting their aspirations and expectations from. They no longer want to be teachers or policemen. They don't want to be presidents. They just want to be drug dealers. This is a very serious problem. And once I was talking to Eduardo before we walked in about the Mara Pacts in El Salvador, these gang pacts, whole families that depend on a child becoming a Mara. So we have no institution can stand all of this when in the old-fashioned schemes, when we thought there was an indication that said that when we, in the past, we knew that the world ended here. There was a saying of here be dragons. Here be dragons now are just around the corner. That is the most serious challenge and problem that our democracies are facing nowadays. Thank you to Dr. Carina Perelli. I leave the floor to Paulina Duarte. Thank you. The question they made me regarding the corruption in governments. I think it is a very good question because we know that this is a problem that is very deep, and it's not individual or just about public servants that are corrupt, but especially of the infiltration of criminal organizations into the governments. We now know that many of our countries have organizations that are infiltrated in executive, judicial, or legislative branches. So what should we do? It appears to me that in the last year, and especially in this decade, only through a joint work and collaboration of the countries, some of them led by international organizations such as the OAS, that should work on developing corruption control mechanisms, especially those kind of mechanisms for transparency. And I can give you a very clear example in my country, in Brazil, where a new law, a new transparency law makes our citizens, enables our citizens to have information that is nearly immediate regarding to the countries to the country and to governmental information. So it appears to me that the control is fundamental. Social control, transparency, and especially in the legal mechanisms of controlling our legislations. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Paulina Duarte, for this last remark. Now I would Mr. Roberto Campa to give us a last remark based on the questions of the audience. Thank you very much. First, I would like to talk about the role of the U.S. in the drug thing. I think it should be said that they play an important role. The market is there. Consumption over there is higher than 10%. They are funding nearly the whole process. Most of the drugs that are being produced are being traded in the U.S. It's seems to me that luckily things have changed, and the position of the U.S. has changed in the last years with regards to the role they should play in comparison to the rest of the countries in the European Union. They tried to become the judges that would certify who was doing right and who was doing wrong. But I think that right now there's a different scheme. We have a new vision that we know we have a common problem that we should be facing together. And I think that a discussion that we're having today and that would be a core for the future discussions is that it's that of the legalization of drugs. The country that is taking it the most forward regarding legalization of drugs is the U.S., who is going beyond or further than Uruguay and other countries. For example, there are 22 states in the U.S. in which medical use of drugs is allowed, and 2 states in which they have recreational use is allowed. For example, surveys today say that there's nearly 60%, 40% of who is in favor. This is going to change radically that equation on drugs, not only in our continent, but in the whole world. I've had the chance to have a conversation with officers of the U.S. on this topic, and I don't think they have a clear idea of what is going to happen in the future and what they're going to be doing in the future years. On if the modern state is vulnerable and if we are close to a failed state, I believe the modern state is very complex. I don't believe it's more vulnerable. I don't think so. I think we're very far from being in a failed state. I think it's a very weak idea. We are in the process of change, of modification. We don't have a crisis in our democracy. We are changing most of those laws that have to do with education, but we still have a very important structure where we're educating children, millions of children every day. We are changing our financial and tax schemes. We are not in the middle of a financial crisis. Yes, we are in disturbing times, but that happens with all modifications. Now, with regards to the role of universities for the prevention, we work with several universities, not just designing their programs, but in implementing some of the actions in each of those regions. 75 universities in the whole country, of course, the UNAM, the Polytechnical Institute of Mexico, and all kinds of universities that are local to Mexico City, those in the rest of the country, that are taking part not only in research but in the implementation of these measures. They talk about a program called Glories of Sports. We recruit an important group of former soccer players who we are linking with social organizations that are experts in working with children. We work with Save the Children and other organizations like this, and we come close to the most violent and dangerous communities to identify youth between 14 and 16 years old who are right at the border of being in conflict with the law, and we've involved them in processes with which, through athletic discipline, we help them to build a project for their lives. We're trying to modify their vision of things. We're trying to make them a more difficult prey for delinquents and crime. Thank you, Undersecretary. To close this second round, I ask Dr. Sergio García Ramírez for his final remark. I celebrate the presence of Dr. Leonardo Valdez. I will not repeat what I just said about him and about his administration. I will let somebody else tell you what I said about you, but I am very happy to see you here. I decided to take on 2 topics for these 3 minutes. One of them is with regards to the true nature of crime. Is it an economic, education, moral, ethical problem, or is it all of those at the same time? I think it's a topic of classic criminology. What are the real factors that cause crime? I think it's all of them. And I'm sure several more that are not considered here, because it is a very good question that is already advancing, making an anticipation to the answer. With regards to the youth, I would like to rescue this very accurate statement talking about the needy community of youth that doesn't work and doesn't go to school. Sometimes it seems like this there are kids who want to be the one that should be called Fini is our whole system that doesn't give any kind of solutions or hopes and aspirations. There are some people that are in between the shadows providing some solutions, and we already know who those people are, and they are very appealing to those millions and millions of youth, of children and adolescents and teenagers who don't have an education, who don't have work, and whose horizons seem more closed than open right now. And the second topic, they are asking if a reform to the criminal system would be enough. It would be enough to contain the criminal wave and to prevent a peak of crime. The criminal system that falls within the social system, which would be more than enough, is probably to make a reform to the social system to which this criminal system belongs. But I think taking it a little bit further in this question is we haven't even began doing a reform to our criminal system. What we have been doing in these last years is just making reforms to laws, legislate, making some deliberations on some laws. The criminal system as such is waiting for this true reform that I just talked about. In 2005, we made a reform to the Constitution to generate a new scenario for children and youth who are in conflict with crime and criminal law. A few years after that, the only thing that is standing is the text there in the Constitution, because the truth is that in this environment, it says something else. In 2008, we also made a reform to the Constitution to generate a new system of criminal procedure that has was functioned some more or less, but it's about to collapse. But I refer to it as a very ambiguous system. We need this kind of conciliation between the political and authoritarian flows or currents. We could talk about the reform to the criminal system when we know now that in Mexico City of policemen within uniform are kidnapping people. It's not just one police, 2 or 3. It's a large group of large group of policemen that were captured by the lens of a news reporter. We can't talk about reform of the criminal system when we know that a dozen of another federal policial system has been working on kidnaps too. Is this reform to our criminal system? Because this makes part of our criminal system. Police are part of our criminal system, and I think that the most delicate and critical element, it isn't just the justices of the Supreme Court of Justice. It's actually the policemen and other elements and components of the system itself. Not to speak now about the suppression to which we referred here, which is the ultimate culmination of the criminal procedure that happens today, and that is a total disaster in our country right now. Total disaster that doesn't stand up to the idea of social rehabilitation, because we are usually rehabilitating criminals to fall back into crime, not the society. We should really make a deep reform. Thank you, Dr. Sergio García Ramírez. I would just like to close up this with a final remark. To end this fourth session in which our panel has been focusing on analyzing the state and security in the democratic consolidation processes. I would like to make reference to several topics. First, to the clarity and straightforwardness of the ideas of our panelists, who were very clear in giving answers to the questions of this panel in this session. And I would like to acknowledge all the support that I had to take to make this session possible within the time frame that we have. We are closing exactly on time, and the time that we had allocated. I think the most relevant is that for purposes of concluding this very important forum on democracy, we have the final conclusions and considerations of each of our panelists. So in particular, I would like to thank, on behalf of the organizing institutions of Federal Electoral Institute, its chair of the board, Leonardo Valdez, I would like to thank Carina Perelli, Paulina, Duarte. Thank you very much for your participation. Mr. Undersecretary Roberto Campa, thank you for being with us in this roundtable. And I would also like to thank very much my dear friend Sergio García Ramírez. Thank you very, very much for your participation. Thanks to all of you, members of the audience, for your attention. Good afternoon. We will have a 15 minutes break and we'll return for our last session of the day.